They laughed, they whispered. At my husband's funeral, my own family acted as if I were invisible. Every gesture, every word was meant to erase me. But I had learned that silence can speak louder than outrage. The room was a careful arrangement of appearances. Chairs were placed with precision, flowers chosen to convey solemnity. Yet each decision seemed designed to remind me that I did not belong. I stood at the back, unnoticed, my eyes tracing the familiar faces that once held warmth for me, but now wore masks of indifference. My daughter-in-law whispered to my son, laughter dancing between them like cruel punctuation, and I felt the sting of every unspoken slight. As the ceremony began, memories flooded me. The late nights spent caring for my husband, the sacrifices no one noticed, the family events I had meticulously organized. And now, here, in the sanctuary of shared grief, they were attempting to rewrite my place in our family narrative. Every small smirk, every rolled eye was a deliberate stroke in the portrait of my erasure. I reminded myself to breathe. Patience had always been my greatest ally. I did not need to shout. I did not need to confront. Every detail mattered. The pattern of whispers, the timing of gestures, the way they positioned themselves in the room. They believed invisibility was possible, that I would shrink into the shadows, silenced by grief and propriety. But I had spent a lifetime learning how to see what others overlooked. The smell of lilies mingled with polished wood and old incense, creating an almost sacred tension. My eyes lingered on the items I had contributed over the years, the carefully arranged photographs, the mementos that bore my touch, and noticed with a quiet satisfaction which pieces had been moved, which had been subtly altered. This was not just a funeral, it was a battleground of attention and legacy, and I was fully awake to the rules of engagement. I recalled earlier gatherings where my suggestions had been ignored, where my words had been overshadowed by louder, more insistent voices. The pattern repeated here, but now I observed with the clarity that comes from experience and foresight. Each act of mockery, each whispered aside, fed into a larger narrative, a narrative I was fully prepared to challenge, not with fury, but with measured, deliberate response. As the officiant spoke, I felt a calm rise within me. The world could laugh, they could whisper, they could attempt to erase me, but I had learned to let silence serve as my voice. Every unnoticed glance I returned, every composed gesture was a quiet statement. I had not disappeared. I was present, and I was counting, taking note, and planning. This was only the beginning. 3 days earlier, I had begun to prepare. Small movements, letters hidden, conversations noted. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know what to look for. But I knew. And now, as the funeral progressed, my mind mapped the events to come. This day was not an ending, it was an opening for reclamation, for subtle justice, for the quiet assertion of dignity long ignored. The service drew on, each moment meticulous, each ritual observed. And as I stood in the back, feeling the weight of exclusion, a strange clarity washed over me. I was not powerless. Their attempts at ridicule, their mockery and whispers had revealed more than they knew. Each slight, each calculated oversight had marked the vulnerabilities they believed I held. And vulnerabilities, I realized, were the perfect starting point for measured, deliberate strength. As the officiant spoke, I felt a calm rise within me. The world could laugh, they could whisper, they could attempt to erase me, but I had learned to let silence serve as my voice. Every unnoticed glance I returned, every composed gesture was a quiet statement. I had not disappeared. I was present, and I was counting, taking note and planning. This was only the beginning. 3 days earlier, I had begun to prepare. Small movements, letters hidden, conversations noted. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know what to look for. But I knew. And now, as the funeral progressed, my mind mapped the events to come. This day was not an ending. It was an opening for reclamation, for subtle justice, for the quiet assertion of dignity long ignored. The service drew on, each moment meticulous, each ritual observed. And as I stood in the back, feeling the weight of exclusion, a strange clarity washed over me. I was not powerless. Their attempts at ridicule, their mockery and whispers, had revealed more than they knew. Each slight, each calculated oversight had marked the vulnerabilities they believed I held. And vulnerabilities, I realized, were the perfect starting point for measured, deliberate strength. As the officiant spoke, I felt a calm rise within me. The world could laugh, they could whisper, they could attempt to erase me, but I had learned to let silence serve as my voice. Every unnoticed glance I returned, every composed gesture was a quiet statement. I had not disappeared. I was present, and I was counting, taking note, and planning. This was only the beginning. 3 days earlier, I had begun to prepare. Small movements, letters hidden, conversations noted. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know what to look for. But I knew. And now, as the funeral progressed, my mind mapped the events to come. This day was not an ending, it was an opening for reclamation, for subtle justice, for the quiet assertion of dignity long ignored. The service drew on, each moment meticulous, each ritual observed. And as I stood in the back, feeling the weight of exclusion, a strange clarity washed over me. I was not powerless. Their attempts at ridicule, their mockery and whispers, had revealed more than they knew. Each slight, each calculated oversight had marked the vulnerabilities they believed I held. And vulnerabilities, I realized, were the perfect starting point for measured, deliberate strength. I watched my children, my son at my side, though hesitant, the daughter-in-law smirking at what she assumed was my resignation. I did not move. I did not speak. But inside, my resolve solidified. The years of quiet observation, of patience, of careful attention to the details others ignored had brought me here. And now, the moment had come to wield that accumulated insight, not with noise, not with anger, but with a precision that only silence could achieve. Every whisper that floated across the room, every laugh that sought to diminish me, only sharpened my awareness. I cataloged their movements, their expressions, the rhythm of their interactions. And in that catalog, in the quiet analysis of every slight, I found my advantage. They believed they had the upper hand. They believed that exclusion would silence me. But silence is not absence. Silence is a tool, and I had become master of it. By the time the ceremony concluded, I had already begun to see the first possibilities of reclaiming what was mine, not with confrontation, but with calculated presence. My heart, steady, unshaken, reflected a dignity they could not touch. This funeral, they thought, was their stage, their opportunity to erase me. But I had learned, over decades of careful living and quiet resilience, that visibility and power are not always measured by applause or recognition. They are measured by control, by insight, and by the patience to act at the exact right moment. As people filed out, murmuring and glancing over their shoulders, I lingered. I allowed them the illusion of victory while I committed every detail to memory, every pattern to my strategy. Today was not a loss. Today was preparation. And when the time came, I would speak, not with volume, but with consequence. The world may not have noticed me today. They may have assumed I was defeated. But beneath the calm exterior, a quiet storm of awareness and intention was gathering, and when it moved, no one would be able to ignore its power. 3 days before the funeral, I had started to notice the small signs that something was being plotted behind my back. A letter misplaced here, a phone call intercepted there, and the subtle changes in my children's behavior. All indicators that someone was maneuvering to diminish my presence, even in mourning. My intuition, honed over decades of observing human behavior, told me that this was not mere oversight. It was deliberate, and it required a response both careful and calculated. I spent hours sifting through old documents, photographs, and letters, seeking anything that could affirm my rights, my place, and my legacy. The lawyer I had quietly retained years earlier became my silent ally. Through brief meetings, whispers of guidance, and discreet consultations, a plan began to take shape. I knew confrontation in public would be messy, noisy, and ultimately unsatisfying. The true power would come from subtle, undeniable proof of what was rightfully mine. At home, I reconstructed my timeline of interactions with my family, noting every slight, every dismissal. Each memory, once painful, became data, a map to understand the dynamics at play. The daughter-in-law had grown confident, emboldened by my perceived passivity. Her smirks, her casual insult, even the way she positioned herself in photographs, all revealed a miscalculation. She believed silence meant surrender. She was wrong. By the evening before the funeral, I had assembled the essentials: copies of wills, letters from friends and witnesses, and a small collection of documents proving my contributions to the family's assets. The lawyer I had quietly retained years earlier became my silent ally. Through brief meetings, whispers of guidance, and discreet consultations, a plan began to take shape. I knew confrontation in public would be messy, noisy, and ultimately unsatisfying. The true power would come from subtle, undeniable proof of what was rightfully mine. At home, I reconstructed my timeline of interactions with my family, noting every slight, every dismissal. Each memory, once painful, became data, a map to understand the dynamics at play. The daughter-in-law had grown confident, emboldened by my perceived passivity. Her smirks, her casual insults, even the way she positioned herself in photographs, all revealed a miscalculation. She believed silence meant surrender. She was wrong. By the evening before the funeral, I had assembled the essentials: copies of wills, letters from friends and witnesses, and a small collection of documents proving my contributions to the family's assets. Every piece was cataloged, every detail noted. I was preparing for more than a service. I was preparing for the assertion of dignity, for the quiet reclaiming of authority that had been denied to me. Sleep came fitfully that night. My mind, restless yet focused, replayed every encounter, every whisper, and every slight. I imagined the funeral, the positioning of each chair, the smiles of condescension that would attempt to unsettle me. I reminded myself that patience and observation were my allies. Each moment of stillness would serve as a measure of control. And in that quiet, I felt the first stirrings of empowerment, an awareness that I had waited, watched, and now I would act. The next morning, I rose early. The sun had barely touched the horizon when I reviewed the documents one last time. Everything was in order. The envelope containing the most critical evidence rested in my bag, a silent promise of revelation at the perfect moment. I dressed carefully, choosing attire that would not call attention but would convey composure, dignity, and presence. This was a performance of silence, a declaration without sound, a statement that I was not to be dismissed. As I approached the house, the first guests arrived. Their faces, familiar yet suddenly distant, greeted me with the practiced warmth of those who believe they hold the advantage. I offered measured smiles, small nods, and allowed the whispers to wash over me. Each one was cataloged, stored, and analyzed. My children's unease was subtle but noticeable, a crack in the armor that had seemed impenetrable. They were unsure of how to reconcile my calm with the narrative they had constructed in their minds. Inside, the room was arranged exactly as I had feared. Seating had been manipulated to favor certain individuals. Floral arrangements highlighted the absence of my contributions, and the officiant's script subtly reinforced the narrative of exclusion. Yet I moved with purpose, positioning myself in the perfect spot to observe, to document, and to endure. I was invisible only in their eyes, but fully present in every detail, in every calculation. As the ceremony began, I allowed my mind to drift through memories of past gatherings, noting parallels and differences. I recalled birthdays, anniversaries, and moments when my presence had been taken for granted, ignored, or undermined. Each memory, once painful, now served as a source of strength. I had endured and I had learned. The small injustices, the whispers, the smirks, they were all part of a pattern that I now recognized, understood, and planned to counter. When the first murmurs of mockery arose, I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply observed, cataloged, and waited. The room, filled with the voices of those who sought to diminish me, became a stage for my strategy. Their arrogance, their assumption that silence equated to weakness, was their mistake. And as the minutes stretched, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me, a prelude to the subtle, unassailable victory I was about to claim. After the funeral, the house still smelled faintly of lilies and wax. People had gone, leaving behind cups, tissue paper, and a silence that felt heavy and deliberate. I walked through my own rooms and felt a coldness where warmth had always been. Drawers that once held letters and photographs were slightly ajar. A box of recipe cards, the ones my mother had written by hand, sat on the porch as if someone had tossed it out with the recycling. The sight of them on the damp step made my chest tighten. It was not chaos. It was careful erasure. Someone had taken the time to move things, to choose what would remain visible and what would be relegated to the street. My favorite shawl, the one I wrapped around myself on cold mornings, was missing from its usual hook. A photograph of my husband and me on our 50th anniversary had been turned to the wall. The changes were small, but they were cumulative, like a series of tiny cuts. I gathered the scattered items and brought them inside. I smoothed the recipe cards with my hands and read the familiar loops of my mother's handwriting. Each line felt like an accusation and a comfort at the same time. Whoever had thrown them out had not accounted for the way memory clings to paper. Who would think to discard the small, ordinary things that hold a life together? My son called that afternoon, his voice half apologetic, half wary. He asked how I was, and I heard the daughter-in-law in the silence between his words. I did not accuse him. I did not scold. Instead, I asked him questions I already knew the answers to, and in the pauses of his replies, I found confirmation. He had stood with them at the front of the room. He had smiled at their jokes. He had allowed the narrative to proceed without interruption. I made a list that evening. I wrote down every missing item, every moved photograph, every small humiliation that had been arranged like props on a stage. The list felt absurd, as if I were cataloging the weather. Yet each entry was a small stone in the foundation of the case I was building. Memory has weight when it is documented, and evidence grows stern when it is assembled patiently. My lawyer recommended a quiet approach. He had known me for years, and he understood my preference for motion without drama. He suggested we begin with careful inquiries, discreet formal letters, and proof of ownership where it mattered most. We would not shout in the street. We would not seek spectacle. Instead, we would present facts that could not be waved away by smiles and whispered jokes. There are ways to make silence speak. Paper can testify. Witnesses can remember. Signatures can be compared. I learned to love the slow, certain mechanics of legal work the way some people love the feel of soil under their fingernails. Each document we prepared was a small triumph of order against the chaos of spite. I found a neighbor who had seen the daughter-in-law carrying boxes to a car the morning after the funeral. He had not thought much of it at the time. He thought she might have offered help. He did not realize that the boxes contained keepsakes being moved without my consent. His face flushed when he recalled the small details we asked him to remember. He became a witness not because he sought justice, but because he had noticed what he had noticed. A bank statement revealed an odd transfer that coincided with the timing of my husband's recent incapacity. I did not have the expertise to interpret it on my own, but my lawyer saw the pattern immediately. Small withdrawals here, a redirected payment there, an attempt to reassign accounts in ways that made the past vanish into new names. It was not grand theft. It was the quieter art of reassigning legacy until there was nothing left to claim. I took notes with a neatness that surprised me. The world had a way of misplacing people when it suited them. I would not allow it to misplace me. Each phone call I made was careful and measured. I spoke to the probate clerk, to the accountant, to a woman who had once been my neighbor and who remembered my husband's small habits, like the way he always left 2 spoons in the drawer for tea. It seems trivial, but these fragments of shared life had power when collected and presented with calm. At night, I slept in short stretches and woke with plans forming in the spaces between dreams. I imagined the courtroom not as a place of spectacle, but as the gentle, clarifying light that removes the smudges from a face. I imagined the daughter-in-law's confident smile dimming as clerks and records and witnesses told a different story than the one she preferred. People who have not been moved to the margins often imagine that return requires shouting. That is a myth. The real work is methodical. It is a matter of planting seeds in a field of assumptions and waiting for the evidence to sprout. It is also a matter of choosing the right moment to show the harvest. There were small risks to this method. The daughter-in-law might anticipate our moves. She might burn documents or shift ownership more quickly. That is why secrecy was essential. Only a handful of people knew the full extent of what we were compiling. My lawyer, the neighbor who had witnessed the boxes, and an old friend from the bank formed a quiet chain of allies. Their discretion matched my own. When the daughter-in-law arrived at the house to collect items she believed were hers, I was not there to create a scene. I had asked a friend to be present, to receive what was offered and to record details. I did not confront her face to face. I let her act while others watched and remembered. Her boldness in that moment was evidence of her belief in impunity. One evening, I opened a drawer and found a letter that had been folded and hidden. It was a note my husband had written years ago about small things that matter. His handwriting trembled, but his words were steady. He wrote about the way his mother used to arrange flowers, about the sound of rain on the kitchen roof. He wrote about promises made in quiet rooms. That letter was not a legal document, but it was a tether to a life someone was trying to unmoor. I copied the letter and gave the original to my lawyer. Even the softness of a memory carries weight when it is treated with care. It was not revenge to protect what was left of a life. It was justice to ensure that memories could not be reshaped to suit convenience. As the days passed, the tension in the house became a physical thing. I moved through rooms with the calm of someone who knows the terrain. I watched my children from a distance, noticing the discomfort that flickered across their faces when a neighbor referred to my role in past family events. Those flickers told me more than loud confessions ever would. The daughter-in-law tried to recruit sympathetic acquaintances. She posted subtle messages, friendly images that spoke of unity and family. People commented, and their words were kind. But kindness arranged itself around a narrative, and a narrative could be corrected with facts. I did not reply to her public gestures. I let her perform her version of the story while we gathered the evidence that would correct it. One morning, I received a call from the probate office. A clerk asked for clarification about a document that had been filed. The voice was neutral, professional. The implication was that someone had claimed authority to make changes that required further explanation. It was not victory, but it was a sign that the quiet work was having an effect. I kept my composure as always. Anger is a useful teacher, but a poor companion for strategy. I felt anger, certainly, but it moved like a river beneath the ground. Above the surface, I smiled and arranged flowers, placed familiar objects back in their spots, and brewed tea for the neighbors who dropped by with condolences. These ordinary acts kept me tethered to the life I had built, and they provided the cover for a patient plan. In the small hours when I sat at the kitchen table with paper spread around me, I felt the strange exhilaration of someone finally acting on a truth. It is an odd thing to feel hopeful in the middle of conflict, but hope is not the same as certainty. It is a readiness to engage with what must be set right. I was ready, and I was not alone. Their confidence was a kind of blind spot. It revealed the carelessness of those who assume dominance without regard for the consequences. I intended to expose that carelessness with the slow insistence of documents and witnesses and the calm testimony of a life that could not be erased by polite laughter. Justice in its quietest form was taking shape around me. The turning point did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like a quiet knock at the door and the soft unfolding of a paper I had kept hidden in a place I knew only I would think to look. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but the signature at the bottom carried the weight of a life we had shared. It was the kind of evidence that did not shout. It stated. I remember the moment I slid the paper across the table to my lawyer. His face grew still in the way that professional faces do when something important has been placed before them. He did not gasp. He did not lean forward in theatrics. He took the document, read it with a precise calm, and then folded his hands on the table. That calm was the sound of a plan beginning to assemble itself. There were the small things that mattered, an old insurance policy tucked into a book, a letter from a family friend that mentioned arrangements discussed in private, the ledger my husband had kept of purchases and promises. When combined, these fragments painted a different picture than the one presented at the funeral. They showed a pattern of shared decisions and acknowledgments that could not be easily reinterpreted. My lawyer suggested we compare handwriting, examine dates, and gather witness statements. He introduced me to a probate specialist who worked slowly and with the kind of attention that matched my own. We requested copies of recently filed documents and noticed discrepancies in language that suggested they had been altered after my husband's illness. Small additions here, a changed date there, a clause that appeared to shift ownership in ways inconsistent with the family's history. I remember sitting in a bright office while a clerk handed over a stack of photocopies. The edges of the paper crinkled under my fingers like the first page of a book someone was trying to rewrite. The differences were subtle, and that was their strength. Subtle changes avoid scrutiny. Subtle changes assume trust. That assumption had been their greatest mistake. A woman who had been my husband's neighbor for 30 years agreed to speak with us. She remembered details I had almost forgotten, like the time my husband had insisted that a particular painting remain in the living room because it reminded him of his mother. Her recollection became testimony when written and signed. Another friend provided letters that referenced conversations about the will and the importance of preserving family heirlooms. We hired a handwriting expert to examine signatures on several documents. Watching the expert at work was like watching someone decode a language. He pointed out loops and pressures in the pen strokes, the way certain letters leaned like private jokes between old hands. When the expert compared the contested signature to earlier, undisputed examples, the differences were clear enough to merit formal examination. At the same time, an accountant we consulted traced a series of financial transfers that coincided with my husband's decline. There was no dramatic theft, no headline to be made. Instead, there was the careful rerouting of funds and the quiet reassigning of responsibilities that left the family ledger looking tidy while erasing the presence of the person who had once held those accounts. The accountant presented a timeline that matched the changes in documents, and that timeline became another piece of the puzzle. What surprised me most was how ordinary these instruments of erasure appeared when taken alone. A photocopy here, a stamped date there, but when we layered them together, a pattern of intention emerged. The strength of our case lay not in one loud declaration, but in the accumulation of details that could no longer be ignored. We assembled a small team of allies: my lawyer, the probate specialist, the handwriting expert, the accountant, and the neighbor who had observed the boxes. Each person brought a different kind of testimony. Each testimony was careful and restrained. We planned how to present our findings in a way that left little room for plausible denial. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law continued her social gestures, confident and unaware. She posted photos of family dinners on social pages, smiling as if the world accepted her version of events. She attended neighborhood gatherings, her laughter easy and untroubled. Her confidence was useful to us. It kept her from seeing the slow machinery being set in motion behind closed doors. There were moments when I felt the urge to act with force, to stand in a hallway and demand an explanation. I resisted that urge because I had learned that loudness attracts attention but rarely secures results. Our work required discretion. It required patience. It required that we reveal facts in a way that made silence an ally to truth rather than an instrument of doubt. One evening, my lawyer called and asked me to come to his office. I took the bus, feeling the familiar sway of the city outside, and sat in the leather chair while he spread documents across his desk. He showed me a comparison of signatures, a list of witnesses he had already interviewed, and a draft of the letter he would send to the probate court. It was a careful, unassuming letter that asked for formal review without accusation. The letter's language was gentle but firm. It invited clarity. We decided to file for a temporary injunction to prevent any further transfer of property while the court reviewed our evidence. The request was procedural and measured. It stopped short of dramatic claims, but placed a legal pause on actions that could complicate our case. The moment the injunction was filed, the world shifted a little. Actions we had only been watching from the sidelines were forced to slow. I remember the morning the probate clerk returned our call. Her voice was professional and efficient. She confirmed receipt of our filing and informed us that the court would require copies of the contested documents for review. That confirmation was small, but it felt like a crack appearing in the polished facade my family had attempted to present. In the days that followed, I watched the daughter-in-law's confidence begin to falter in small, almost imperceptible ways. She made a call and covered the receiver with her hand. She sat in the kitchen and scrolled, her smile tightening at something on the screen. These were not admissions, they were micro-fissures. They were the reactions of someone who was beginning to notice that the air around them had thickened. Our next steps were surgical. We compiled the documents into an organized packet with clear annotations. We enlisted a witness to provide a notarized statement. We arranged for the handwriting expert to prepare a formal report. Each step reduced the space in which a friendly smile could shelter an altered fact. I did not relish the process. The legal world felt foreign and cold, with its own rhythm and language, yet I found solace in its structure. The methodical pace mirrored my own temperament. The weight of paper and signatures mattered because they carried truth in a way that social gestures could not. In small moments between meetings, I walked through the rooms of our home and touched the objects that had been moved and returned. I straightened the photograph that had been faced to the wall and placed it where it belonged. These were acts of caretaking and defiance in equal measure. They reminded me that reclamation was not only about documents, it was about restoring the ordinary, the daily attestations of a life shared and recognized. By the time we had assembled the evidence, I felt less like a victim and more like an archivist of a life that would not be rewritten. The turning point had not been a single revelation, it had been a sequence of small discoveries, each one laying another stone in a structure that would hold up under scrutiny. The quietness of our approach was our advantage. They had relied on noise and charm, we relied on proof. As the day to submit our packet approached, I felt a clarity I had not known I would find. The case had become less about punishment and more about truth. I wanted the record to reflect the life we had lived and the contributions I had made. I wanted my husband's memory to be carried without omission, and when the proper moment arrived, the law would speak in numbers and signatures, and silence would no longer be a weapon against me, but a shield I could raise with confidence. The courtroom smelled of paper and polished wood, the air taut with the quiet gravity of official things. I sat near my lawyer, the packet of documents resting like a small, patient argument on his lap. It felt strange to be in a room where silence had weight, where people spoke in measured phrases, and where the smallest detail could tilt a decision. I steadied myself with the simplicity of a breath and watched as the day unfolded. When our turn came, my lawyer stood and presented the evidence with plain language and careful cadence. He did not raise his voice, he did not seek drama. He laid out the documents, the handwriting report, the bank records, and the notarized statements one by one. Each item was a quiet piece in a puzzle that, when assembled, refused to be ignored. The judge listened, head inclined, finger steepled, and the room waited on the slow work of facts. The handwriting expert spoke with a calm I had come to trust. He pointed to loops and pressures, to dated ink and consistent slants, and he explained how signatures could change when someone was weakened or coerced. The accountant traced the redirected transfers with precise patience. The neighbor recounted the morning she had seen boxes moved, and her memory, offered in a clear voice, filled a small but crucial space in the narrative. As the evidence accumulated, I felt a peculiar sensation. It was as if a light was being turned on in a room that had been dimmed. The things that had seemed like small slights now formed an unmistakable pattern. The daughter-in-law sat across the room, her smile gone, her posture shifting with an unease I had not seen before. She had counted on the softness of social assumptions, the reluctance to challenge a family's internal arrangements, and the power of a practiced narrative. She had not counted on paper and witnesses. The judge asked a few pragmatic questions, not to provoke but to clarify. His voice was steady, his tone neither cold nor indulgent. He inquired about dates, about the chain of custody, about the circumstances under which certain documents had been presented for probate. Each question was a small instrument that brought clarity. Our lawyer answered each one with composed detail, and in those exchanges the truth took shape in the plain light of procedure. There was no grand reveal, no dramatic speech that would make for a movie scene. Instead, the revelation came in the accumulation of minor certainties. The handwriting report showed inconsistencies. The bank records revealed transfers that aligned with a narrative of reassignment. Witness statements placed the daughter-in-law in the position of moving items without permission. When the judge looked at the documents and then at the people in the room, he did so with the effectiveness of someone tasked with restoring order to a complicated history. At one point, the daughter-in-law tried to speak. Her voice was quick and defensive. She claimed misunderstanding, she claimed confusion, and she offered explanations that sought to fold the facts into her version of events. She relied on warmth and the familiarity of family to cushion her words. But in that room, with paper and order and witnesses steady, her words had nowhere firm to land. The judge listened, then asked for clarification that required specific evidence. She had none to offer. When the judge issued a ruling to uphold the injunction and order a formal review of the contested transfers and documents, I felt a rush that was both quiet and fierce. It was not vindictiveness that moved through me. It felt like relief in the presence of truth. The court did not need melodrama. It needed accuracy. The accuracy had been assembled like careful stitches, and now those stitches held. After the ruling, the daughter-in-law left the room with a small, controlled haste. She passed by me without meeting my eyes. There was no dramatic confrontation. Her pride seemed to fold inward like paper. She had assumed that social performance could replace documentation, and she had been undone by the steady work of facts. It was a sober victory, one that felt more like rightness than triumph. In the days that followed, changes occurred with a deliberate slowness. Items that had been moved were returned. An account that had been reassigned was frozen pending review. My name, omitted in hurried versions of events, was restored in documents that mattered. People who had been willing to accept the narrative of the daughter-in-law found themselves confronted with a different record, and they had to reckon with it quietly. My children reacted in different ways. My son came to me with the awkwardness of someone who had been on the wrong side of an obvious truth. He did not apologize with words at first. He offered small, tangible acts of care that spoke louder than any hurried phrase. He helped me arrange the photographs back in their proper places. He sat with me at the kitchen table and listened to stories I had told him years ago as if he were hearing them anew. Others were slower to shift. Some friends and relatives continued to waver, uncertain which side of the story to inhabit. The daughter-in-law's social circle had to reconcile their impressions with the documents now circulating. Their murmurs and doubts were private and without spectacle. The public performance she had relied upon had less power in the presence of documented truth. I did not seek revenge. The aim had never been to humiliate, but to correct. The correction brought with it a sense of balance that settled into the house like a familiar light. I tended to the small things that signified belonging. I placed the photograph of our 50 years back on the mantel, and I brewed tea the way my husband had liked it. These ordinary rituals became acts of restoration. There were moments of discomfort. I had to attend a meeting with family members where difficult conversations were had about responsibilities and care. We spoke about the future, about how decisions would be made from now on, and about how to honor the history that had been nearly rewritten. Those conversations were not easy. They required humility and the willingness to acknowledge mistakes. But they were necessary. The hard work of reconciliation follows the harder work of truth. In private, I found a quiet satisfaction in knowing that patience and preparation had prevailed. The method of silence had proven itself effective when combined with careful action. I had not shouted. I had not perfumed indignation on anyone's stage. Instead, I had collected facts, gathered witnesses, and allowed the ordinary mechanisms of justice to do their work. There was dignity in that process, a dignity that felt like the echo of my husband's steady voice. People sometimes ask me what I would say to someone who is being pushed to the margins by those they love. I tell them that visibility can be reclaimed in many ways. You can shout, and sometimes shouting is necessary, but the power of the slow and deliberate approach should not be underestimated. Paper, testimony, and calm resolve can cause the quietest of storms to rise and reshape the world. By the time the immediate legal matters had been settled, the home felt like itself again in small, meaningful ways. The photographs were back where they belonged, the recipe cards were neatly stacked in the drawer, and the shawl I loved hung patiently on its hook. These ordinary restorations were the real markers of success. They were not grand gestures, but the resumption of a life that had been interrupted. I walked through the rooms one evening and paused by the window. The light was soft and forgiving. I thought of the days when I had believed silence meant being unseen. I no longer believed that. Silence can be a choice, a strategy, and an affirmation. In the end, silence coupled with action had spoken louder than the laughter that tried to erase me. The days after the court case carried a quiet rhythm that felt both familiar and new. I moved through the house with a sense of gentle authority, arranging pillows, placing a vase in the exact spot my husband had preferred, and laying out the recipe cards so they would be easy to find. These small acts were not triumphal. They were habitual gestures of care that affirmed a life lived and a name that belonged in the home. Visitors came and left, and conversations gradually shifted from polite condolence to practical planning. There were apologies given in awkward, halting ways, and there were silences that had to be respected. My son found language slowly, offering small acts of repair instead of speeches. He washed the teapot and asked which photo I wanted on the mantel. These tiny offerings were more meaningful than any sudden admission. Repair often begins with quiet acts and consistent presence. Some relatives never fully acknowledged what had happened. They accepted the revised records and then arranged their lives around convenience. I did not expect unanimous enlightenment. The world is made of partial truths and small comforts. I accepted that reconciliation may be uneven and that people mend at their own pace. My job was not to force absolution, but to hold to a standard of truth and care. I spent afternoons returning letters to drawers and smoothing the folds of old photographs. Each object I replaced felt like setting a stone back into a path that had been disturbed. The shawl I loved was returned to its hook, not by some dramatic stroke of fate, but by a neighbor who understood what small things mean. That neighbor nodded when she handed it back, and her eyes said what words had not yet formed. Community shows up in quiet ways. The daughter-in-law maintained a distance that was practical and polite. She did not seek confrontation, and neither did I. There was no need for a dramatic scene. The court had done its work, and the records had spoken. Where there had been performance and charm, there was now a necessity to act with responsibility. I focused on that responsibility more than on any lingering resentment. At night, I sat by the window and watched houses across the street settle into their own private stories. The lights blinked on and then dimmed, and ordinary life resumed its quiet course. I thought about legacy not as a ledger or a list of possessions, but as the small, consistent things we do for one another. Legacy is a cup of tea offered without fuss, a remembered anecdote that makes someone laugh, the careful mending of a torn hem. People asked me how I had kept my composure through it all. I had no heroic answer to offer. I had patience and habit. I had friends who believed me when my voice trembled. I had a lawyer who spoke with steady facts, and neighbors who would sign a statement without drama. Most of all, I had the conviction that the truth, when gathered carefully, will not remain hidden forever. I thought about the younger women who reached out to me after the story was more widely known. They sent messages about being overlooked, about small humiliations that add up until a person wonders if they are invisible. I wrote back saying that invisibility can be a strategy, but it can also be a trap. Use silence as a choice, not as a resignation. Learn to document what matters and to gather witnesses who will speak when needed. The house felt fuller in time. My son came for Sunday dinners more often, lingering at the table with questions about recipes and stories. We spoke of my husband as if he were still in the room, and sometimes in the quiet of those conversations, I felt him there. It was a comfort and a sign that the history we shared was not erased by petty maneuvers. Memory, when honored, persists. I also found myself forgiving more easily than I expected. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting or pretending harm had not been done. It meant choosing to carry less weight in my chest and to allow others the space to change. Holding on to anger is a heavy burden. Letting it go or setting it down is a practice that requires courage. One afternoon, I opened the old ledger and ran my fingers over the faded ink. The ledger recorded small purchases and the occasional note my husband had left about a repair or a plan. It was mundane in the way that life is mundane, and yet it was sacred to me. I made a photocopy and gave it to my son, not as a relic but as a prompt to remember the ordinary things that knit a family together. As months passed, the sharp edges of the conflict smoothed. The injunction was lifted once the court completed its review and the proper transfers were reconciled. The documents now reflected a truth that matched our life. That legal affirmation mattered. It was not the end of everything that had been broken, but it was a foundation upon which we could begin to rebuild. People began to visit the house for small reasons, for tea and conversation, not only for formal occasions. They sat with me on the porch and told stories about neighbors and about small triumphs. I listened and I told my own stories too. Storytelling is an act of restoration. Each tale stitched a visible thread through the fabric of a life that had felt frayed. There is an odd humility that comes with having to prove yourself to those closest to you. It reminds you that dignity does not always come from others. Often it must be claimed. The work of reclaiming dignity is quiet and sometimes tedious. It requires patience, documentation, and the willingness to call on allies who will speak with facts rather than feelings. If I could offer advice to someone finding themselves at the edges of their own family, I would say this: keep a record. Keep a few trusted allies. Do not confuse silence with surrender. Learn the tools of proof and use them when necessary. And when truth is restored, let it guide how you move forward rather than how you hold a grudge. In the end, the house became what it had always been. It was a place of shared history and small mercies. The photographs smiled down from the mantel, the recipe cards lived again in the drawer, and the shawl warmed my shoulders on cool mornings. I walked through the rooms with a sense of quiet completion, not because a battle had been theatrically won, but because the ordinary work of assembling facts had led to a just result. My husband would have liked that. He valued order and kindness and the small rituals that make a life coherent. I carried his memory with me as a steady flame, one that guided me through the days when silence could have been mistaken for surrender. Instead, it became the means by which truth spoke. and the house at last reflected that truth.